Chapter 13, Other State and Federal Requirements. So much of what we've talked about in earlier modules, we've really focused on the home program requirements themselves. We've mentioned, in some cases, some of the other state and local requirements, particularly around property standards. But in this chapter, we're going to be talking about a whole laundry list of other state and federal requirements that also apply. So these are not part of the home program, but would be triggered by our projects. And so for each of our folks undertaking a home project, you're going to have some basic understanding of these requirements, when they might be triggered. For most of the topics that we're going to be talking about here, any one of these topics could be a couple of days of training. So we're going to be providing mostly an overview of what these requirements are, when they might be triggered, talking a little bit about how they would impact your home project. But if you do not have, if you are responsible for some of these requirements and there is not other in-house expertise on that, you're either going to need to be bringing somebody in that can provide that expertise, or getting additional training to make sure that you're going to have appropriate skills. I will mention that the ADFA website has a number of good resources in these areas, but also the HUD Exchange has very good resources. There are some webinars, there are some live trainings around the country that go on, but also there are, guidance books and other materials that would be really helpful to try to get up to speed onto that. So let's just jump in and get started on these. So these are our federal requirements, are things that are issued by other federal agencies such as transportation, justice, or labor. They're not part of the home final rule, but they're what we call applicable regulations, or you sometimes will hear people say these are the other federal regulations that are going to apply to your projects. So one of those is fair housing and equal opportunity. So overall, for the operation of the home program, we're always trying to affirmatively further fair housing, making sure that we expand choices for housing and those opportunities, that we are running our programs and the way we get our marketing out so that it's going to be done in a non-discriminatory manner. We want to make sure that everybody has equal access to know about these opportunities and to be able to qualify. So we oftentimes will be spending quite a bit of attention on thinking about how we're going to market our projects, how are we going to notify the public about the opportunity to apply for housing, for some of the services that might be provided, and who would in our community would be least likely to be aware of those opportunities. So we're going to make some special efforts to make sure that everyone is aware of that. We also have Section 504, which has some coverage about employment, but the main impact for us under the home program has to do with handicap accessibility. So there is a set aside of units for both mobility impaired and also sensory impaired. 504 is triggered when we have new construction with 5 or more units in a project. It also would be triggered for rehabilitation, where our rehabilitation cost is at least 75% or more of the replacement value for that property. So when we're doing really significant rehabilitation, then we're going to have some extra requirements to make sure that we make some units within that structure meet our handicap accessibility requirements as part of that. Section 3 is a very important aspect of this. What Section 3 is, the goal of Section 3 is to expand opportunities for low-income persons that are living within that project area. So anytime there are jobs that are being created as part of a triggering project, or where we have contracting for goods or services, that we want to make sure that those qualifying businesses in the area would know about those opportunities. So ADFA has a Section 3 plan in place, which identifies the triggers for Section 3 and would have essentially a standard plan of actions that you as the responsible entity or recipient of those funds, and then contractors and subcontractors would need to take in implementing that project. So there would be Section 3 language within the contracts that are associated with the project that would require the contractor, the prime contractor, and he would be passing on the responsibility to the subs to make sure that when there were employment or contracting opportunities, that this standard outreach to make sure that Section 3 qualifying persons or businesses would know about those opportunities and to be able to track and report that back to ADFA. So one of the reasons you need to make sure you always read your written agreement is that these will be called out within your written agreement. You need to make sure that you, as part of your implementation plan, are ready to make sure that you're going to maintain compliance with these requirements. Along with this, we have our Minority and Women in Business Enterprises, MBE, WBE requirements, which are generally along the same lines, where we're trying to make sure that qualifying minority and women-owned businesses would have an equal opportunity to be able to compete for participation in these programs. In some cases, there would be a goal or a threshold requirement that, again, would be an ADFA requirement that you would look to your written agreement to make sure what was going to apply. Let's talk a little bit, turn to labor standards. So our federal labor standards is the Davis-Bacon Act. For the home program, this is triggered when we have 12 or more home-assisted units that are within a construction contract. So, for instance, we talked in earlier modules about the fact that because we're able to do cost allocation, we might have a 60-unit new construction rental project that might, based on the funding and the cost allocation process, might have, let's say, 11 home-assisted units, and that would be called out within that written agreement. Because it is not hitting the 12 or more home-assisted units designation, that project would be exempt from the Davis-Bacon requirements. It's 12 or more units under home. For those of you that may work with the CDBG program, the trigger for that program is 8 units, so different for different programs. So this is applicable for that project, for any home project, no matter where those home funds are actually being put into that project. So the fact that the construction contract, maybe they're not using any home funds because home funds were only used for acquisition of the property, it is still a home-funded project. If it has 12 or more home-assisted units, it will trigger these requirements, and the steps that we're going to be talking about would be required to be completed as part of that. So if we have a Davis-Bacon triggering project, there will be requirements as part of the bid solicitation and the contracts that would need to be included. So there would be standard clauses within the bid solicitation that would identify that this is a Davis-Bacon project. It would include the Davis-Bacon wage decisions as part of that bid packet, so that our contractors that are going to submit a bid for this project would be basing their bids and the labor hours that their labor rates that they're projecting based on the Davis-Bacon wage rates. So this is essentially a federal wage rate. It might be different than what a non-federal triggering project might pay. So if I have someone who's operating, let's say, heavy machinery, they might, based on market rates in their area, maybe they're being paid $24 an hour for that work. Davis-Bacon rate might be higher than that. So it might be that they're to be paid under Davis-Bacon $29 an hour. So those bids would need to be based upon the applicable Davis-Bacon wage rates that would be included in that bid solicitation, and that would also be captured within the contract. As part of the Davis-Bacon Act compliance, we would need to include in the pre-construction conference a review with the contractor and the subcontractor about the requirements of Davis-Bacon. So when we have Davis-Bacon requirements, the prime or general contractor is going to be submitting certified payrolls on a weekly basis for review to make sure that they are in compliance with the wage rates. They also will be required to collect those certified payrolls from all the subcontractors. This will be throughout the life of the project, so there may be a whole mix of subcontractors at different phases within that construction project. As part of this, those wage reports will be reviewed and compared to the applicable rates, but there also will be on-site interviews that will be conducted by either the recipient or by ADFA staff in determining compliance with that. So interviews would be conducted at the job site with a worker, identifying who they were, what the job duties that they were completing, and then comparing that to the certified payroll that has been provided. So that all would be discussed as part of the pre-construction conference so that our contractors, the subs, and staff all knew what the requirements were as part of that process. Other labor laws that are going to apply, we have our Contract Work Hours and Safety Standards Act, which is related to no more than 40 hours per week being worked without overtime being paid. It also includes some safety standards. The Fair Housing Labor or the Fair Labor Standards Act also includes some language about federal minimum wage and overtime requirements. And then the Copeland Anti-Kickback Act has requirements about payments being made on a weekly basis, but it also has some language about what's allowable as a payroll deduction. And this really goes back to sort of earlier days when we had some company towns and we had some companies that were paying a wage, but then essentially backing out much of that through a whole series of payroll deductions. And so this act has some requirements about what is allowable to be deducted from that worker's payroll. And then I want to mention site and neighborhood standards. So this is a home requirement that applies when we have new construction of rental. So it doesn't apply when we're doing rehabilitation, doesn't apply when we're doing new construction of home buyer units. It's only for new construction of rental projects. And what the site and neighborhood standards requirements are is that ADFA is required to have a review form in place. And essentially, they're looking to see when the decision is made about where new rental housing is going to be placed, that we're not placing it in areas with high minority or crime or low income concentrations, that we're trying to expand choices for housing. Oftentimes, the site and neighborhood standards adopted by that PJ will also include things about, access to transportation, other hazards, things that would have an impact on the folks that are going to be residing in that unit. So in the case of site and neighborhood standards, this is not something that you as a recipient of the funds will be completing, but know that this is a home requirement that ADFA will be completing that review. And that's part of the reason they're asking some of the questions that need to be included in your application for funding so that they can go through this determination. So let's talk about the lead-based paint requirements. This is going to apply to any property where we have structures that are pre-1978. So in 1978, the production and sale of lead paint was generally prohibited. There are still a few uses that are allowed. But so any structure that is going to be a rental, a sale unit, rehabbed, we're going to need to, for those 1978, pre-1978 units, we're going to have to make sure that our lead paint, we're making an evaluation of the hazards and then taking appropriate action. So part of this includes some disclosures to tenants, to owners. And so at each of our stages, there are going to be some required notifications that would be in place. There would be a disclosed notice that will go to each recipient, and it will include the HUD pamphlet, which is Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. You'll also be completing a visual inspection of any deteriorated paint. Now, depending on the level of work that's being done, we may be doing a risk assessment, and then as part of that, we'll be making a determination of what level of remediation would be required for that specific property. If that property includes the lead hazard reduction work, we're also going to be providing that household with information about the testing that was done and the clearance tests that would be done so that they would have that documentation in place and also be aware of what work was being done, what hazards might be in place or having been eliminated from their property. So the regulations are found at 24 CFR subpart J for rehabilitation, and what we're addressing is stabilizing any deteriorating paint surface, making sure that we use lead-safe properties. So there are some properties that would be exempt from this. If we have a property that is found not to have lead, and that might be that we know that anything that is 1978 or newer is exempt from that, but we might have a property that when we do a risk assessment, we determine that there actually is no lead paint that has been used. Lead paint oftentimes was more expensive, and as in the years getting closer to 1978, it was being used less and less. We also may have properties that have been abated, so all the lead paint has been removed. If we had documentation of that, then that property also would be exempt from having to take any further actions on that, and we would make sure that we had that documentation in the file. In some cases, we might be doing a very limited rehabilitation that might not disturb any paint surfaces, and so we might be exempt from that. Also, if we're doing demolition and then we're going to replace that unit, or we're simply clearing a building as part of maybe a new construction rental property, or we're clearing an outbuilding on residential property, demolition itself is not subject to the lead paint requirements. So we have a couple of options on how we're going to calculate the lead hazard evaluation and reduction standards. So the regulations allow you to use either the per unit rehabilitation, so that's the hard costs that are related to the rehab, or the per unit federal assistance, and that's the lower of the two. And the rehabilitation hard costs actually do not include any of the costs that are part of the lead work. So for instance, if I, as part of my lead work, were going to be removing and replacing windows, that cost would not be part of my calculation on the level of hazard reduction that would need to be completed. Why that would be important is that it might be that by calculating based on rehab hard costs, not including some of those things that are lead costs, might have us being at a lead hazard reduction level as opposed to triggering full abatement on the property. So it's important to understand those requirements. So our evaluation, we really have an evaluation test here, and then also a test on what's our level of remediation. So if we have less than $5,000, we're simply going to be doing paint testing on that, on those surfaces that are going to be impacted by our project. If our project, our funding based on our determination on hard rehabilitation costs is at $5,000 to $25,000, we're doing a risk assessment. We also would be doing a risk assessment if we were over the $25,000 mark. As part of this, as I mentioned, we're going to provide a notification to that household within 15 days of that inspection. The regulations do allow for a presumption of lead and a separate notice that simply lays out that notice of presumption. It is no longer considered a best practice to use the notice of presumption. What the notice of presumption means is that instead of testing, I'm going to make the presumption that every surface, painted surface, is going to include lead, and I'd have to treat all of those surfaces, whether they actually included lead paint or not. What has been found over the years is that if you were to do the presumption, that you would be spending money treating, trying to reduce lead hazard on a lot of surfaces that actually don't include any lead. So the best practice has become do the risk assessment, treat only those surfaces based on the risk assessment identification on that. And it's a much better way to operate on that. So you talked about what the testing levels were. This is now what the level of remediation would be. So if I have less than $5,000, then I'm simply going to repair whatever surfaces I am disturbing, and I'm going to be using safe work practices as part of that work. So maybe my project is replacing a heating cooling system, and the only painted surface maybe I'm going to be dealing with would be where I have the thermostat on the wall, and I'm going to be following safe work practices when I do that replacement. For $5,000 to $25,000, I'm going to be using interim controls and also using safe work practices, and I'm required to have trained workers. So in that case, I might be encapsulating, I might be covering those surfaces, but I'm not required to remove every bit of lead that would be within that house. Once I go over $25,000, then I will be doing what we call a full abatement, and I will be removing then all lead surfaces. I'll be using safe work practices, and I'll have a certified supervisor and workers on that site. So as part of this, once that work has been completed, we're going to do a clearance test. And a clearance test is essentially testing to see, have we gotten all the lead? Have we cleaned up adequately and removed all of the lead dust that might have been created as part of that process? So they're usually a wipe test that then is sent to a laboratory, and they're testing for bits of lead and that concentration to determine whether it is acceptable or not. So we're not going to pay our lead contractor until that clearance test has been performed, the results have come back in, and it's been determined that that property now is within acceptable limits. If those tests would come back and they would show that there still is lead hazard present, then the contractor would be required to go back. Generally, they're going to be conducting what's called the scientific cleaning, so they're going to re-clean and remove that lead dust, particularly that's been left in that area. They would then do another clearance test to see that those results were now within the acceptable parameters. Only after we get an acceptable clearance test would payment be released to that lead contractor as part of that. And as part of that, we're going to provide a notice to that property owner within 15 days of that clearance test. So we provide them good information about all of the results, and it gives them also records for what's been done for that house and how it was found to be acceptable. I'm going to switch gears here to another section of the federal overlay of requirements. The Uniform Relocation Act, URA, really came about when we had the federal freeway system and urban renewal, where a lot of federal dollars were being used to purchase and oftentimes demolish properties. And there was concern that those owners of the properties, in dealing with the federal government, didn't necessarily know what their rights were and may not have been compensated appropriately. So the Uniform Relocation Act was put in place to try to put protections in place where we have federal dollars that involve both acquisition of property and also any displacement, any relocation of the tenants, owners, occupants, whether that be residential or commercial. It also covers all of our voluntary acquisitions, including a home buyer assistance. So when we're doing down payment assistance and closing costs, we need to have that documentation in place. So as part of, and I would think that probably most everything that's going to be done as an acquisition is going to be a voluntary acquisition. ADFA is not going to be using its potential of power of eminent domain on this. So we're going to be documenting each of our acquisitions as a voluntary acquisition. This has to be done, completed prior to executing that sales contract. So it's pretty simple. We're going to use a standard form and notify them, the seller, that in the case where you have the buyer has the power of eminent domain, we would be giving that up. In other cases, that notice is going to identify that even though there are federal funds in this project, I don't have the power of eminent domain. This is going to be a voluntary transaction, so that if we can't reach an agreed upon price for this property, that you're going to walk away, that you don't have the ability to take that property. So that notice will tell them about their rights. It will also notify them that owner-occupants of those structures are not eligible to receive any kind of relocation assistance because they are voluntarily part of this process. There also is a requirement that they be notified as part of this notification under URA of what the estimate of fair market value is. We're making this assumption that they might not be well informed of what the actual value of the property is. So as part of that, we would either have an appraisal done. Generally, that's not going to be done. We're going to either use someone that's knowledgeable in the real estate market to determine a value. In some cases, these properties are already listed and that they have listed what they believe the fair market value would be. If you, as the recipient on this, feel that that listing price is an appropriate representation of the real estate value for that property, that also could be utilized. So this voluntary acquisition notice must be done before that sales contract is executed. So for instance, if I was running a down payment assistance program and I was going to income qualify buyers, tell them to then find a property in their community that they wanted to purchase, we'd need to make sure that before that sales agreement was executed, that there would be a voluntary acquisition notice that had been completed as part of that. So when we have an occupied property, we need to determine who actually lives there. If it's the owner who occupies that unit, and we've provided that voluntary acquisition notice, we've determined they're not eligible for any relocation benefits because they're voluntarily wanting to sell their house, and we are covered on that. But if we have a tenant that is occupying that unit, the tenant is not voluntarily part of this sales transaction, and they would be eligible for assistance. So as part of this process, we need to determine who actually is occupying that property. Is it vacant? Is it occupied? To determine that liability. So under the Uniform Relocation Act itself, any lawful occupant would be provided notices if they were going to be displaced. we would provide them advisory services. We pay for their moving and the utility costs, but we also could be paying for replacement housing assistance, and that's whether they were permanently being displaced or temporarily. If we have a project that is going to allow new tenants to move in, we would want to make sure that they are provided what we call a move-in notice, which simply tells them that there's the potential of a project occurring on this site, and because you've been notified about that before you move in, you're not going to be eligible for Uniform Relocation Act funding and assistance. So a list of ADFA forms that would be utilized for compliance with the other federal funding sources that we've been talking about. There is a required minority and women business enterprise plan. There's also an affirmative fair marketing plan for single family and also for multifamily. And then we reference the Site and Neighborhood Standards Review form that ADFA will be utilizing as part of their review for compliance. And that, again, remember, Site and Neighborhood Standards applies to our newly constructed rental projects.